A cold winter night. A desperate cry echoes through the frozen forest. A tiny gray wolf pup, barely breathing, lies abandoned in the snow. His mother is nowhere to be found. His chances of survival? Almost none. But then, a stranger appears. What started as an act of kindness would turn into an unbreakable bond, one that would be tested by fate in ways no one could have imagined. This is the true story of a man and a wolf, a story of love, sacrifice, and the incredible resilience of nature. But be warned, what happens next will break your heart. Stay with us until the end to witness a journey that will forever change the way you see the wild. And before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss an inspiring story like this one. The storm had been relentless for days. Thick layers of snow covered the mountains of Montana, turning the forest into an unforgiving wasteland. For any creature left exposed, the cold was a death sentence. Jack Mason, a retired wildlife ranger, had seen many brutal winters in his time, but this one felt different. The world seemed quieter, almost eerie, as if nature itself was holding its breath. He was making his way back from a supply run to a small cabin he called home, nestled deep in the woods where he had chosen solitude over society. Then he heard it. A sound so faint, so fragile, it could have been mistaken for the wind. But Jack knew better. It was a cry of something small, something helpless. His boots crunched against the frozen ground as he followed the sound, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then he saw it, half buried in the snow, a tiny gray wolf pup shivering violently. Jack crouched down. The pup's fur was matted with ice, his ribs showing through his thin coat. His breathing was shallow. He couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Alone. Vulnerable. Jack's first instinct was to look for the mother. He scanned the woods, his heart pounding. Wolves didn't just leave their young behind, not unless something terrible had happened. And then he saw it, a trail of blood, leading into the darkness. Jack's throat tightened. His years as a ranger had taught him the brutal realities of the wild. A mother wolf wouldn't abandon her pup unless she had no choice. He hesitated. Taking a wild animal home was dangerous. If the mother was still alive, she would return. If the pack was nearby, they might see him as a threat. But as he looked down at the trembling pup, he knew one thing for certain. If he left him there, he wouldn't make it through the night. Jack removed his thick jacket and carefully wrapped the pup inside, cradling him against his chest. The tiny creature barely moved, his body stiff from the cold. Jack whispered softly, "You're not dying tonight, little guy." And with that, he turned back toward his cabin, completely unaware that this decision would change his life forever. Jack kicked the door open with his boot, stepping into the warmth of his small, rustic cabin. The fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. He hurriedly closed the door behind him, shutting out the howling wind. The pup in his arms was barely moving now, its breathing shallow, almost imperceptible. Jack had seen death before, too many times. He knew what it looked like, and this little creature was barely clinging to life. Gently, he placed the bundle down on his old couch, peeling back his jacket. The pup let out a weak whimper, its tiny body twitching as if trying to fight against the cold that had sunk deep into its bones. Jack knew hypothermia could kill faster than starvation. He had to act quickly. Rushing to the kitchen, he filled a small metal bowl with warm water, then soaked a rag, wringing out the excess before pressing it carefully against the pup's frost-bitten paws. The little creature flinched, but it was too weak to resist. Jack worked methodically, rubbing warmth back into the tiny body. "Come on, little guy," he muttered under his breath. "You're not giving up on me." Minutes passed like hours. Jack kept rubbing, kept whispering, his own heartbeat matching the slow, uncertain rhythm of the pup's breath. Then, a twitch. The pup's ears flicked, its tiny nose sniffing weakly at the air. Jack exhaled, not realizing he had been holding his breath. "That's it," he murmured, encouraged. "Stay with me." He got up and grabbed a towel from a nearby chair, wrapping the pup up tightly. There was no wolf milk in his cabin, but there was something close enough. He poured some warm goat's milk into a small bottle he had used years ago when nursing an injured hawk back to health. Would it work for a wolf pup? He had no idea. But he had to try. The pup didn't resist when Jack pressed the bottle gently to its lips. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, with a weak, desperate motion, the tiny jaws latched onto the rubber tip. Jack almost smiled. "There you go," he whispered. The pup drank slowly, its frail body barely able to manage the effort. Jack could feel the warmth returning to its limbs, its breath evening out. He sat back in his chair, watching the little thing fight for survival. And just like that, he was invested. Jack hadn't planned on this. He had left his past life behind for a reason, because caring for something, for someone, always led to pain. He had lost too much already. And yet, here he was, cradling a tiny, wild creature in his arms, promising himself he wouldn't let it die. The night stretched on. Jack barely slept, his eyes flicking open every time the pup moved. When morning came, the storm had passed. But Jack knew his troubles were just beginning. Because saving a wolf pup was one thing. Keeping him alive was another battle entirely. Morning came slowly, the pale winter sun casting a soft glow over the cabin. The snowstorm had finally relented, leaving behind an eerie silence, the kind that only came after nature's fury had passed. Jack Mason sat in his old wooden chair, his back aching from a restless night. His gaze remained fixed on the small bundle of fur nestled in a thick wool blanket near the fireplace. The pup had survived the night. That alone was a miracle. Jack leaned forward, studying the tiny creature's slow, rhythmic breathing. The pup was no longer shivering violently, though his frail body still bore the scars of the brutal cold. His fur was matted, his paws cracked from the frost, and his ribs jutted out beneath his gray coat. A fighter, just barely. Jack exhaled, rubbing his tired eyes. He hadn't planned on rescuing a wolf. He had spent years pushing people away, isolating himself from the world after retiring from the ranger service. A lifetime spent in the wild had taught him a simple truth. Everything in nature had an order, a cycle. Weak things perished. Strong things survived. That was the way of things. And yet, here he was. He shook his head. Damn it, he muttered, standing up. The pup stirred at the sound of his voice, his tiny ears twitching. Jack froze, watching. He didn't expect much, but then, two pale blue eyes fluttered open. For the first time, the wolf pup was looking at him. Jack felt something in his chest tighten. He had seen countless animals in his time: majestic elk, black bears, even a few wolves at a distance. But this was different. Those blue eyes, still clouded with weakness, held something that made him pause. Fear? No. Something else. Recognition. The pup didn't whimper or try to move away. He simply blinked, exhausted, as if trying to understand the strange world around him. Jack cleared his throat. "You're tougher than you look, kid," he murmured. The pup's little nose twitched at the sound of his voice. Jack sighed and stepped away. He needed to figure out what to do next. Raising a wild animal was a terrible idea. He knew that better than anyone. A wolf wasn't a dog. They didn't belong in houses or by firesides. This pup would grow into a predator, one that could never truly belong in the world of humans. But if Jack let him go now, he wouldn't last another day. His mind was at war with itself. He moved to the kitchen, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He kept his back to the pup, forcing himself to think logically. The best thing to do was to get in touch with one of the wildlife rehabilitation centers a few towns over. They had the resources. They could do what needed to be done. Jack took a sip of coffee, staring at the steam rising from the mug. Then he heard a sound. Soft. Hesitant. He turned. The pup had lifted his head slightly, his tiny body trembling with the effort. He was staring at Jack, his mouth barely open. A faint whimper escaped. Jack's grip tightened around the mug. Damn. That sound, so weak, so dependent, hit him harder than he expected. Jack set the coffee down and walked back over to the pup. He knelt down, reaching out a hesitant hand. The little wolf sniffed his fingers, his nose cold and wet. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years building walls around himself, shutting out the world, believing he was better off alone. And yet, here was this tiny, fragile creature, pressing his cold nose against his calloused palm, trusting him, needing him. Jack sighed heavily, running a hand down his face. "All right," he muttered. "Guess we'll figure this out together." The pup let out a tired little huff, as if satisfied with Jack's decision. Jack sat down beside him, his mind already racing with questions. What did he feed him? How would he care for him? Would he ever be strong enough to return to the wild? He didn't have the answers. All he knew was that, for now, the pup wasn't alone. And maybe neither was he. The days that followed tested both Jack and the fragile little wolf pup in ways neither of them had expected. Jack had always been a man of routine. Solitude suited him. Every morning, he'd wake at dawn, chop firewood, and prepare coffee in silence, the only sound being the occasional howl of distant wolves in the vast Montana wilderness. But now, his routine was shattered. Every action revolved around the tiny life he had brought into his home. The pup was weak, struggling to even stand on wobbly legs. His ribs jutted out, his fur still patchy from the frostbite he had endured. Jack had seen injured animals before. Some made it, many didn't. But this one refused to die, and Jack couldn't help but admire that. He sat by the fireplace, watching as the pup attempted to move. The tiny creature's legs trembled beneath him, his paws slipping against the wooden floor. He let out a frustrated whimper. Jack leaned forward, his voice rough but strangely gentle. "You gotta fight, kid." The pup turned his head, those icy blue eyes locking onto Jack's face. There was something haunting in them, something ancient, something wild. Jack sighed and stood up. He grabbed a bowl of warmed goat's milk and kneeled beside the pup. "Come on," he coaxed. "You need to eat." The pup hesitated, his little body tense with fear. Jack knew trust wasn't something that came easy, not for a wild animal, not for him either. But after a few heartbeats, the pup inched closer, sniffing the bowl. Then, with a hunger that spoke of days of starvation, he began to drink. Jack let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. For the first time in years, he felt something stir in his chest, something he had buried long ago. Hope. Caring for a wolf pup wasn't as simple as taking in a stray dog. Jack knew the risk he was taking. He had no experience raising wolves. What he did know was that if this pup had any chance at survival, he had to grow strong. But strength came with challenges. One morning, Jack woke to the sound of tiny, struggling movements. He found the pup near the couch, attempting to stand again. His legs trembled violently, his claws scraping against the wood as he tried to push himself up. Jack crouched beside him. "You're stubborn, huh?" The pup let out a soft growl, more frustration than aggression. Jack watched as he tried again. His little legs shook, his entire body working against weakness, against exhaustion. He faltered, but he didn't stop. Jack didn't interfere. He could have easily reached out, steadied him, helped him, but some things had to be fought alone. Minutes passed. The pup panted, his small chest rising and falling rapidly. But then, just when Jack thought he would collapse again, he stood, on all four legs. Jack felt something tighten in his throat. "You did it, kid." The pup swayed slightly but stayed up. His tail, still too thin to properly wag, twitched slightly in triumph. Jack ran a hand through his graying beard. He hadn't expected to feel this invested. This wolf wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. And for the first time in a long time, Jack found himself wanting something he had long thought lost. To fight, too. Days turned to weeks. Jack built a small bed near the fireplace, filling it with blankets and an old pillow. The pup took to it quickly, curling into the warmth at night. Every morning, Jack would take him outside into the crisp mountain air. The first time, the pup hesitated at the threshold, his little nose twitching as he sniffed the cold wind. Jack crouched beside him. "You belong out here, don't you?" The pup hesitated for only a second before stepping onto the snow. His paws sank into the icy powder, and he let out a startled yip. Jack chuckled. But then, something changed. The pup lifted his head. His nose worked quickly, his ears perked up at the distant sounds of the forest. The rustling of trees, the whisper of the wind, the faint call of a raven overhead. Something primal awakened in him. Jack saw it. The recognition of home. The pup turned, staring at him, as if waiting. Jack exhaled. "Go on." The pup took an uncertain step, then another. His small frame, still thin but stronger than before, moved with growing confidence. Jack followed, his boots crunching against the snow. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The bond between them grew quickly, more quickly than Jack had anticipated. The pup, once so fragile, now followed Jack's every move. He trotted behind him when he chopped wood, sat near his chair when he read by the fire. Every night, when the wind howled outside, the pup would curl beside him, his warmth a quiet reassurance. But Jack knew. This wasn't permanent. Wolves weren't meant to stay. One evening, as Jack sat on his porch, the pup curled up beside him. A distant sound shattered the silence. A howl, low, long, haunting. The pup's ears perked up instantly. Jack felt it, the pull, the instinct. The pack was out there, calling. Jack's throat tightened. He had spent weeks nursing this little creature back from the brink of death. He had fought for him, cared for him. And now, nature was beginning to pull him back. He reached down, running a calloused hand through the pup's fur. "You're gonna have to leave someday," he said softly. The pup didn't understand the words, but Jack did, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. The first time the pup howled, it was a sound barely above a whisper. A small, uncertain cry, somewhere between a whimper and an instinctual memory buried deep in his blood. Jack had been outside, stacking firewood, when he heard it. He turned slowly, watching as the tiny gray wolf lifted his head toward the sky, his body stiff with some unseen force pulling at him. The sound was weak, unrefined, but it was there, a part of something greater than either of them. Jack set the firewood down and wiped his hands on his flannel shirt. "You figuring it out, huh?" The pup glanced at him, his ears twitching. Then he tried again. This time, the sound carried a little further, though it was still thin and fragile. Jack felt something inside him clench. It was starting. The wild was calling him back. As the weeks passed, the pup, whom Jack had reluctantly started calling Ghost, grew stronger. His legs no longer wobbled beneath him. His ribs were filling out. His coat, once sparse and rough, was thickening with soft gray fur, and with that strength came something else, a restlessness. At first, it was subtle. Ghost would stand by the window for long periods, watching the tree line. His ears would flick at the distant sounds of the forest, branches snapping, the wind carrying the echoes of unseen creatures. Then it became more obvious. Jack had started taking him deeper into the woods, letting him explore beyond the clearing around the cabin. At first, Ghost had been cautious, sticking close to Jack's side, but soon his steps grew more confident. His nose constantly worked the air, picking up scents Jack couldn't begin to detect. The pup was learning what he was. Not a pet, not a stray, a wolf. Jack knew this day would come. He had told himself from the very beginning that this wasn't forever, that Ghost belonged to the wild, not by his fireplace. But knowing it and accepting it were two different things. One crisp morning, Jack took Ghost to the farthest point they had ever gone, a ridge overlooking the valley below. Ghost had grown in the weeks they had spent together. His legs were longer, his body no longer fragile. He wasn't the tiny, shivering pup Jack had found in the snow. He was something else now. A wolf on the verge of becoming what he was meant to be. Jack crouched beside him, staring out over the valley. The forest stretched endlessly before them, wild and untamed. "This is where you belong," Jack muttered. Ghost's ears twitched, but he didn't look at him. He was fixated on something beyond Jack's understanding, a pull deeper than words. Jack exhaled. "Go on, then." Ghost turned, finally meeting his eyes. There was hesitation there, uncertainty. Jack felt his chest tighten. "You hear them calling, don't you?" Ghost lowered his head slightly, almost as if he understood the weight of what was being said. Jack clenched his jaw. He shouldn't be hesitating. He knew how this had to end. But when he reached out, running his hand along Ghost's back one last time, he knew something terrible. He wasn't ready. He wasn't ready to let him go. Ghost let out a small sound, almost like a whine. And then, he did something Jack never expected. Instead of running, instead of disappearing into the wild where he belonged, he sat down beside Jack and stayed. Jack closed his eyes for a long moment, exhaling slowly. He had saved the pup's life once. And now, somehow, it felt like the pup was saving him. As much as Jack wanted to believe Ghost could stay, he knew it wasn't that simple. Wolves were feared, hunted. Ghost wouldn't be safe near humans. And Jack knew that if he stayed too long, he'd never learn how to survive in the wild. The dilemma twisted inside Jack like a knife. Keeping Ghost meant risking his life in a world that wasn't made for him. Letting him go meant accepting the silence, the loneliness, all over again. Jack had spent years convincing himself he was better off alone. But now, that loneliness felt unbearable. One evening, as Jack sat outside, Ghost lying at his feet, the sound came again. A howl. But this time, it was closer. Jack stiffened, his fingers instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the porch. Ghost's ears perked up. His body went still. The call came again. Jack recognized it now. A pack. Ghost lifted his head, staring into the darkness. Jack could almost see it happening, the war inside his mind, the primal instinct battling the familiarity of the man who had saved him. Ghost let out a sound, a whine. Jack's throat tightened. "You know what you gotta do," he murmured. Ghost hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Jack. Jack forced himself to look away. This was never about him. This was about Ghost becoming what he was meant to be. Another howl. Closer now. Ghost let out a small, uncertain growl. He took a step forward, then another. Jack swallowed hard. "Go." Ghost stopped. Jack clenched his jaw. "Go on now. They're waiting for you." Ghost took another step, then another, and then, without a sound, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness. Jack sat there for a long time, staring into the woods, listening to the sounds of the wild reclaiming what was always its own. The silence that followed was the loudest thing he had ever heard. The cabin had never felt so empty. Jack had spent years in solitude, years convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that he was better off alone. But now, with Ghost gone, the silence was unbearable. Every morning, he found himself glancing at the small bed by the fireplace, expecting to see a pair of icy blue eyes staring back at him. But the bed remained empty. Every evening, as he chopped wood, he caught himself listening for the soft padding of paws on snow, for the familiar huff of breath in the cold air. But there was nothing. Just silence. It had been 2 weeks since Ghost had left, and Jack hated himself for how much he missed him. One night, as Jack sat by the fire, he caught himself doing something that made his chest tighten. He was holding Ghost's old blanket in his hands. It still had strands of gray fur woven into the fabric, still carried the faintest scent of the pup he had raised. Jack exhaled sharply and tossed it aside, cursing under his breath. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had prepared himself for this, hadn't he? From the very beginning, he had known Ghost couldn't stay. He had known that wolves weren't meant to be tamed, that they belonged to the wild. So why did it feel like he had lost something more than just a wolf? Why did it feel like he had lost a part of himself? Jack threw himself into work. He hunted, chopped wood, repaired the cabin. Anything to keep himself from thinking too much. But everything reminded him of Ghost. The scratch marks on the door where he had pawed to go outside. The trails in the snow where they had walked together. The empty space by the fire where he used to curl up and sleep. Jack gritted his teeth. He had survived worse things than this. He had lost people before. He had walked away from a world that had nothing left for him. So why was this so damn hard? Then, one morning, something changed. Jack woke up before dawn, the sky still dark outside. He rolled out of bed, ran a hand over his face, and made his way to the front door. When he stepped outside, the cold bit at his skin, sharp and unforgiving. And that's when he saw it. Tracks. Fresh tracks in the snow leading up to the cabin. Jack's breath caught. They weren't deer tracks. They weren't from a bear either. They were paw prints. Wolf prints. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he followed them with his eyes. They led up to the porch, right up to the door. Ghost had been here. Jack swallowed hard, his hands tightening into fists. He turned his head toward the tree line, scanning the shadows between the pines. The forest was still. He was alone. But he wasn't. Not really. Somewhere out there, Ghost was watching. Jack exhaled slowly. A part of him wanted to call out, to walk into the woods and search for him. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped back inside, leaving the door open just a crack, just enough for the cold air to creep in. And then, he sat by the fire, waiting. The tracks appeared again the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. Ghost never showed himself, but Jack knew. He knew the wolf was near, watching from the darkness, drawn back to the place that had once been his home. Jack found himself leaving food outside, though he never saw it being taken. He didn't need to. Every morning the bowl was empty. It wasn't the same as before. Ghost wasn't by his side, wasn't following him on long walks or sleeping by the fire, but he was there, somewhere. And maybe that was enough. For now. Then, one night, the howls returned, but this time they weren't distant. Jack sat up in bed, his pulse quickening. The sound came from close, too close. It wasn't just one wolf, it was several. A pack. Jack threw on his coat and grabbed his rifle, stepping out onto the porch. His breath came out in white clouds as he scanned the tree line. The howls echoed again. Ghost was out there. But something was wrong. Jack could hear the tension in the cries, the way the notes wavered. This wasn't a simple call between packmates. This was a warning. Then Jack saw it. Shapes moving between the trees. 2 wolves. Then 3. Then 4. They weren't Ghost's pack. They were rivals. And Ghost was caught between them. Jack's grip tightened around the rifle. He had spent weeks telling himself that Ghost was strong enough to survive, that he was where he was meant to be. But now, standing there in the freezing cold, hearing those low, guttural growls coming from the trees, Jack realized something. He couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Not this time. Not when Ghost might not make it out alive. Jack took a step forward into the snow, and with a steady breath, he raised the rifle, ready to protect the wolf he had once saved, ready to fight for him. The night was deadly quiet except for the low, menacing growls echoing through the trees. Jack stood at the edge of his porch, his rifle steady in his hands, his heart pounding like a war drum. Through the dim moonlight, he saw them. 4 wolves, their bodies low, their eyes locked on a single figure standing between them. Ghost. The young wolf stood frozen, his hackles raised, his tail stiff with uncertainty. His body was larger now, stronger, but he was still outmatched. These were seasoned hunters, rival wolves, maybe from another pack, maybe loners looking to kill off competition. Jack knew how this worked. A lone wolf against 4 had no chance. His finger hovered near the trigger. He didn't want to shoot. Wolves were wild creatures. They fought, they survived, they killed when they had to. But Ghost wasn't just any wolf. Jack had nursed him back from death, had fought for him, had watched him grow. And now, he wasn't about to watch him die. Jack inhaled deeply and made a decision. He fired a single shot, high, into the air. The crack of the rifle shattered the silence, echoing across the mountains like a clap of thunder. The wolves jolted, their eyes flashing toward Jack. For a moment, no one moved. Jack narrowed his gaze, his body rigid, his stance unwavering. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the rival wolves let out a short, cautious growl, then turned and backed away. The others hesitated, sniffed the air, and then, just like that, they faded into the darkness. Gone. Jack exhaled sharply. Ghost remained where he was, his body still tensed. His blue eyes flicked toward Jack, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Jack lowered the rifle. "You okay, kid?" he muttered. Ghost blinked slowly. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and disappeared into the trees. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He should have been relieved. Instead, all he felt was emptiness. Jack didn't see Ghost for weeks after that. The food he left outside remained untouched. The tracks in the snow disappeared. The night howls that once echoed near his cabin had gone silent. It was as if Ghost had never existed at all. Jack told himself this was a good thing. Ghost had finally done what he was meant to do. He had become part of the wild, but knowing it didn't make it hurt any less. Days passed, then weeks. The snow melted. Spring came, and the forest breathed new life. Still, Ghost never returned. Jack tried to go back to his routine, but it wasn't the same. He had spent so many years convinced that he didn't need anyone. That solitude was safer, easier. But Ghost had changed that. And now he was alone again. Jack accepted it, or at least he tried to. Then, one evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he heard it. A sound he hadn't heard in months. A howl. But not just any howl. Ghost. Jack sat up straighter, his heart racing. He stood, stepping onto the cold wooden planks, his eyes scanning the tree line. And then, a figure emerged from the darkness. Ghost stood at the edge of the clearing, no longer the frail pup Jack had rescued from the snow. He was taller now, his fur thick and strong, his body lean with muscle. He had the look of a true wolf, wild and untamed. But his eyes, those same icy blue eyes, were locked onto Jack. Ghost took a slow step forward, then another. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He expected the wolf to keep his distance, to vanish just as quickly as he had appeared. But instead, Ghost did something that took Jack's breath away. He sat down, right there, at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. Jack felt something tighten in his chest. He didn't move, didn't speak, because he understood. Ghost wasn't coming back to stay. But he hadn't forgotten, and neither had Jack. They stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, just as silently as he had arrived, Ghost stood, turned, and disappeared into the trees once more. Jack remained on the porch, his hands clenched at his sides, his heart pounding. He didn't call out. He didn't try to follow. He just stood there, staring into the place where Ghost had been, the weight of what had just happened settling deep in his chest. Ghost was free, and somehow, for the first time in years, Jack was too. That night, Jack sat by the fire, staring at the flickering flames. He had spent years running from the past, burying himself in the solitude of the mountains, believing that isolation was the only way to survive. But Ghost had changed that. He had reminded Jack what it meant to fight for something, what it meant to care. And as the fire crackled softly, Jack allowed himself to do something he hadn't done in a long, long time. He smiled. A small, quiet smile. And somewhere out in the darkness, a wolf howled. Jack closed his eyes, listening. Ghost was where he belonged. And so was he. If this story touched your heart, remember, sometimes the greatest love is the one that sets us free. Jack and Ghost's journey may have ended, but their bond will never be broken. If you believe in the power of resilience, courage, and the unbreakable connection between man and nature, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves powerful stories like this. Because sometimes, the wild has a way of teaching us what it truly means to live.